long period of time between getting to know each other and getting married, right? Yeah. So, in the Orthodox world, that's a really long time. People were asking her, how long have you known David? And they're going, 3 months. And they're going, what's wrong? How come you guys aren't getting married? But for most people, that's a really short period of time. But we were married in March, and we then went to Israel for the first week of our marriage, which is a honeymoon, which the Orthodox don't do, but we didn't know it at the time. But we went to Israel for the first 7 days of our marriage. And so just fell in love with Israel. We went visited Safat and a couple of other places. And then we came back and found out we were pregnant with our oldest daughter, Rachel. Rachel, do you want to say hello to everybody? No, you want to draw. Okay. So Rachel, who's 7, so Rachel Leah is 7 years old. And then we had Yaakov shortly after that, Yaakov Shulam, and he's just turned 6 on Sunday. And so his Hebrew birthday is Kislev 7. And so he just turned 6. And then we had Hoshana Tikva 2 years later, almost to the day. And so she just turned 4. And then our youngest has been running around here. Where is she? Make sure she doesn't have any markers. Chava Chana, she was born in May. And so she just turned 2 last May. She's going to be turning 3 this May. So that's our family, and we have one on the way. So that one's due in end of February, beginning of March, so around our anniversary. And so when we got back, we got pregnant, we decided we were going to move into the Orthodox community, and that's what we did in New York. And we were living not too far away. One of the things that's really sort of unique about us is that we keep the rabbinic and the messianic parts together. So you may be asking or wondering, Aaron told me you guys have a lot of questions for me as to how we make that work. I would love to answer some of those questions. I'm just going to sort of bring up a few sort of hot button topics that we always get asked about. So the washing of hands before bread. People always ask us about that because in Mark chapter 7, it seems to be arguing against that. So something that, one of the ways that we see Mark chapter 7 is there was actually an argument between 2 sets of Pharisees at that time about whether or not you wash for food that you don't eat in the temple, or whether you do eat in the temple. And so one set of Pharisees held that you do not wash your hands for food that is not in the temple or has not been sacrificed in the temple. And the other set of Pharisees believe that you wash your hands only, so Beis Hillel, wash your hands only for food sacrificed in the temple. Beis Shammai, wash your hands for all foods, right? So you have that verse of making all foods clean. The way that we understand that is that he's talking about the food that wasn't sacrificed in the temple and the food that was sacrificed in the temple, and therefore we don't need to wash our hands for food that was outside. And so he took Beis Hillel's point of view, the sect of Pharisees that did not wash for food that was outside of the temple, because he was outside of the temple when that happened. And so knowing the complexities of the arguments that were going back and forth, so that was going on at that time, you would sort of get an idea as to, okay, he's hiding with Beis Hillel against Beis Shammai. The people he was eating with must have been Beis Shammai at that time. The idea that he's talking about all foods being clean, not that we can have like pork and shellfish, but instead that we can have, that we don't need to wash for food outside, that it's clean outside. The chulin the food that's outside of the temple doesn't need to be, chulin is what we call food outside of the temple, doesn't need to have their hands washed. Later on, and as time went on, the group of Beis Hillel eventually said, well, to remember the temple, we wash our hands because that's what you would do in a temple. And so you would wash your hands in the temple with any food. And so basically said, and Orthodox Jews today wash your hands before bread for that reason, to remember this is what we used to do in temple times for holy food so that the idea doesn't completely get forgotten. Another one that I'll bring up that was very powerful to me and sort of blew my mind away and sort of pushed me more into sort of a more rabbinic idea, but we don't actually get asked this question a lot. But in John chapter 4, it talks about this idea of mikvaing, that the baptizing of John's disciples was going on. He was baptizing more than Jesus was baptizing their disciples. And then it goes into this story about a woman at a well. And it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense as to what he's talking about. But if you know Pharisaic Judaism and you know the Mishnah, you can get into, in that story, all different 6 levels of mikvah, or ritual immersion, are brought up in that story. And so the whole story is about the reason it is being brought up in John is because he's teaching something about this idea of ritually immersing and what it has to do with this idea of Messiah. So that's one of the things we also talk about often. Number one is Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, Yeshua says that you shall not have one jot nor one tittle of the Torah to be changed. One of the things that I always like to say is, well, heaven and earth is still here, so we need to focus on that. Jot and one tittle. Tittle would be a Pharisaic addition to the letter. So if you look in the Torah scroll that you have over here, you'll notice that they have little sort of flourishes on top of the letters. Have you noticed that? So that is that's the tittle. That's the and each of those has a specific important rabbinic. So Pharisaic and rabbinic to me go hand in hand, but they are actually 2 slightly different things. So forgive me for that. So if I say rabbinic, I might mean Pharisaic. So I go back and forth between those 2 things. But it's Pharisaic, and they all had laws that were associated with each of those little flourishes on top of the letters in the Torah scroll. The jot is a yud, which also has significance as well. And so you can bring something different depending on how the points are in Hebrew. Each word has a different way in which you can say it, and so he's determining that. And then he goes on in Matthew chapter 5, and he says, you have heard it said, do not commit murder, but I say to you, do not hate. You've heard it said, do not commit adultery, and I say, do not lust. All these kinds of things. And in that argument, he's actually using a Pharisaic, which would be current day rabbinic, mode of interpretation of Scripture. And he's using what's called the Kal v'chomer. So going from general to specific, or from light to heavy. It's 2 different ways in which you can say it. So he's saying the punishment for murder is death, and so the punishment for hate is death. And so he's actually going through and actually saying the law of punishment of, you give up your life if you commit murder. You give up your life, you're stoned to death. In one form, you are stoned to death if you commit adultery. The same way, you should also be stoned for having lust. So he's actually calling us to a higher level of Torah. So in rabbinic literature, we talk about King David and whether or not he actually committed adultery. And so rabbinic literature says that he didn't actually commit adultery, but he simply lusted. And so it's really interesting the way that they approach King David. I'll let you have whether he committed adultery or not, but the way that rabbinic literature approaches it is that all he did was lust, and the issue is because he was such a great, holy, righteous man, lust itself counted as adultery. And so what Yeshua there is doing is saying, no, we don't just go by the straight halakha that the Pharisees were putting out at that time. we go to an even higher standard of everybody who follows me needs to be considered a tzaddik, or somebody who's on the level of like King David. So he's actually calling us to a higher level of Torah. Another one that always gets mentioned and brought up is Matthew chapter 23. He says, don't do what the Pharisees do, but do what they say. And so, because they sit in the seat of Moses. And then he goes on a whole rant, seemingly about how bad the Pharisees are, right? And so this whole argument is all about baseless hatred, baseless hatred, baseless hatred. You're not getting along with one another. And at the end of it, it gets into this idea of talking about the temple. And so, for those of you who don't know, the Pharisees say that the reason that the temple was destroyed was one of the main reasons is because of baseless hatred. Nobody respected another person. So he's hammering down this point of baseless hatred, because at the end of it, he's talking about the destruction of the temple. Our name is Ahavas Chinam. So Ahavas Chinam is the opposite of cynicism, of baseless hatred. So we have baseless love, or free love, I guess you'd say. It can be translated in a number of ways. I had somebody yell at me that actually means free love, and I go, well, yes, but that also has connotations, and we typically translate it as baseless love. So this idea of Ahavas Chinam, or of love without cause, is what will bring the final redemption. It will counteract the issue of sinat chinam, which means baseless hatred. So they were just they were arguing against each other and causing all kinds of divisions over small things, and that's one of the reasons that the temple was destroyed. And so we're trying to counteract that with our name of baseless love, and trying to be loving to everybody who is here, and everybody who we meet. That's a hard job to do, because we always want to get into places where we argue. Another place where we see Pharisaic interpretational methods being used is in the book of Galatians. Yes, I have read the book of Galatians. I don't know if you ever get asked that question, but we get asked that question all the time. And it actually is in Galatians chapter 4, where he's talking about the two mountains and the two children, and the free man and the bondman, the bond child, and he really goes into a great example of interpreting that on all the different levels of interpretation that the Pharisees would interpret it, which is called Pardes. Are you guys familiar with Pardes? What Pardes is? Peshat, Remez, Drash, and Sod. So Peshat is sort of the plain meaning, and then you go to a Remez, which has hints that is hinted to in the Torah, and in this you get a lot of gematria and things along those lines. And then Drash, it means searched out, and it gets a little bit more, I guess you'd say, esoteric at that point. And then Sod is very esoteric. So Sod is used all over the place. But in Galatians chapter 4, Paul really takes you through all those different levels of interpretation. And we can talk about what happens in Galatians chapter 4 is what he's trying to get at later, but he uses those. Another thing that I find really interesting is he talks about all of Yeshua's parables, interestingly enough, show up in the Talmud. And so there are some who say that Yeshua's parables influence the Talmud. I take a different view, and I say Yeshua's parables were just simply parables that were going around at that time that Yeshua is picking up on, right? So there's two different ways you can look at it. You can either say Yeshua's parables influence the Talmud, where the Talmud is accurately recording that these parables were really popular at that time, and Yeshua was using them to teach in the same way that a rabbi would sit down and teach. A whole bunch of different little things that I can get into, but before we get into sort of more of those kinds of things, do you have any questions for me so far? Yes? No? Okay. Yeah.
When you said when you guys got married and went to Israel, you said usually Orthodox don't do that.
Right. So Orthodox don't take a honeymoon. So when you're Orthodox, what you do in life is you find your community, and you would go to your community and you would have feast days for 7 days straight. So each night would be another day of having a feast. We actually find this in John chapter 3. It says on the third day, right? So on the third day, they're running out of wine, and it's the end of the marriage feast. Well, the marriage feast would last for 7 days. The third day indicates that they got married on a day that virgins would get married, which would be, virgins would always get married on a Wednesday. And so the third day would be 7 days. So if you go through the days, you get to the third day, which would be the next day after that. They still keep that tradition, right? So we actually find that as a Pharisaic hint in the wedding at Cana, where it's the third day, they're running out of wine, it's the end of the meal.
Another reason too.
Okay, my wife is bringing another reason why they do it.
Excuse me. So I don't know if you guys are familiar. Did you spill something? I don't know if you guys are familiar at all with family purity laws in the Orthodox community, but if you are, basically at the wedding night, the woman is considered a nida on her wedding night, whether she bleeds or not. And because they can't touch each other for 12 days, it'd be very hard to have a honeymoon. So they have to, it's very much easier to be in the community, so it's another
Yeah,
reason.
so it's good to be in the
Because
community
it's
and you're
assumed-
celebrating.
It's just assumed that, to be careful.
Right. Thank you. So
I've been teaching a class, so I brushed up on it.
those things all come into play, right? So typically you'd have what's called Sheva Brachas, which means the 7 blessings. And so each day you get around and you have a wedding party on the first night, on the second night, on the third night, on the fourth night, on the fifth night, and the sixth night, and the seventh night. And so at the end of the third night, or at the end of the seventh night, it would be the third day because you'd have gone through an entire Shabbat. So that's what's going on there in the wedding at Cana. So the idea is that you want to build in a community. You don't want to run away from your community. So the idea of going on a honeymoon means you're running away from your community. And when you get married, ideally in a Jewish community, it's a community thing. So when you get married, if I was getting married here, I'm not going to get married here because I'm already married, but if I was getting married here, you all would be a part of that. And so the idea is that everybody is a part of making sure that marriage stays and sticks together. So that's the idea in Judaism. Yeah. Yeah, another question?
I don't have a specific question, but I'm just hoping that you'll have a chance to expound more on the ritual immersions around the woman at the well. Talk more about that.
Sure, yeah. So at the woman at the well, you have, I'll actually try to pull it up so I don't misquote anything. But the woman at the well is in John chapter 4. So it starts out in John chapter 4, verse 1. It says, "Now Yeshua knew that the Pharisees heard that he was making and immersing more disciples than John." And then it goes into the Samaritan, it just talks a little bit about that, and it goes into the Samaritan woman. So in the Galilee is the first place in which you would mikvah, right? So a lake is a place in which you can mikvah. It's a natural mikvah. Typically, you have to make sure that it's not leaking and it's not man-fed, but the Galilee would be one of those mikvahs. And so that's one of the ways in which you purify. So then he comes through Shechem, and now Jacob's well was there. So Jacob's well, a well, is another type of mikvah. So you can actually ritually immerse in a well. and you can ritually immerse. Usually, you wouldn't yourself immerse in a well, but you would immerse maybe utensils or something along those lines. So that's the next one. Now Jacob's well, and that's in chapter 6. So Yeshua, exhausted from the journey, was sitting by the well, right? It was midday. So we have two mentions of the well. A Samaritan woman comes to draw water. Give me a drink. Yeshua tells her, and his disciples have gone away to buy food. The woman, let's see. So there is the idea of the bucket to pull it up. Where is that bucket to pull it up? So the bucket to pull it up would be another mikveh. Will be another aspect of mikveh as well. And so the bucket to pull it up. How many do I have right now? Yeah, you don't have a bucket, right? So I have the Galilee. I have the well. I have the bucket. And let's see. Yeah, so I got that one. And then we have living water, which is the next mikveh. I knew I had all 6. Where are they? So we have the living water. I'm at 4 right now, I think, right? Or am I at 5? 4? The well. The well is twice. The well, Galilee, the pitcher, the thing to draw the water, and the living water. So I'm missing one somewhere. I'm not sure exactly where that is. The living water, the well. So you go through, and there's 6 different levels of mikveh, and they go up in levels of holiness, right? So you want to be able to, you can only do certain things with certain ritual washings. Some of them are for utensils, some of them are for people, some of them, so like a woman can only use mikveh that is living water, a man can use water that is not living water. And so those are able to be, those are all able to be used. And a fountain of water. There it is. So the fountain of water is the next one. So now you have all 6 levels of mikveh. The living water is really the most important one. It's the most powerful one in order to purify. Okay. Okay. Because my phone's dying. Okay. So those are the different kinds of ritual immersions. So it's really interesting because there's a ritual immersion center in California, and they didn't have water in this part of California, but they had plenty of snow up in the mountains, and so they got all the snow and they brought it down, and they actually made their mikveh from snow. You can actually mikveh things in snow. So if you have enough snow up in the mountains, you can ritually immerse there. Might be a little cold, but you can do it. And so that's another place where you have those different levels. And so for me, when I went into synagogue and I learned with somebody all the different types of mikveh, I said, wait a second, all those different kinds of mikveh all happen in, everybody knows what mikveh is, right? Okay, so I sometimes my wife tells me, translate. People don't know what you're talking about when you use Hebrew. So you have all those, I learned the laws of mikveh, and I said, that's all in John, and it starts with ritual immersion. Maybe John is trying to say something about ritual immersion with this woman at the well, and we've sort of missed it because we've been trying to figure out what is it talking about, and we've disassociated from where it came from, like the historical place in which it came from. We see these things even at the beginning. So One of the projects that we're working on is coming up with a commentary on the New Testament using rabbinic sources. And so we actually have 5 chapters of Matthew. One of the things that we were trying to do,
Same plug.
Oh, plug. One of the things that we're still working on, and we really want to finish, is this rabbinic commentary on Matthew. So using rabbinic interpretational methods, using Pharisaic and rabbinic sources, we want to put Yeshua in the context of how he would have been understood and how the Gospels would have been read in first century Judaism. So we're trying to use Mishnah and Talmud in order to be able to go back and sort of reconstruct what the people at that time would have been sort of thinking about. And so we've been able to get through the first 5. We have videos out for the first 5 chapters of Matthew. Aaron, did we finish Matthew? I don't think so. Matthew 5. Did we finish Matthew 5? We didn't finish Matthew 5. Okay. So we're still working on Matthew chapter 5. And so we're raising funds in order to be able to produce videos going through like we are right now on all of the rabbinic nuances that are seen in the Gospel of Matthew. But starting in Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, it begins with a rabbinic understanding. And so it says in Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, it talks about this idea of Yeshua. Let me pull it up so I don't sound silly. So Matthew chapter 1, the book of the genealogy of Yeshua HaMashiach ben David. So for those of you who don't know, Orthodox Jews break up Messiah into 2 separate Messiahs. What you would typically understand as the second coming is Mashiach ben David, which Matthew is using right here to refer to Yeshua. He says he is Yeshua HaMashiach ben David, which makes my life very difficult. Because proving that he's Ben David and the second coming, when it certainly isn't the second coming, is quite difficult. But Chabad helps me with that. But he's using a rabbinic understanding of Mashiach. He understands that there's a Mashiach ben David and a Mashiach ben Yosef. So Mashiach ben Yosef is the Messiah who dies because of the sins of Israel. And so Matthew is opening up with a very bold statement of that he's Yeshua HaMashiach ben David, right? So we put the comma in the wrong place. If you read it in a rabbinic commentary and how first century Jews would have understood it, of the idea of Mashiach ben Yosef, Mashiach ben David, he is stating Yeshua is Mashiach ben David. And he's using it very much in that way. And so he opens up with this idea of a rabbinic addressing of title for Yeshua. Because Mashiach, in the sense of Mashiach, one of the things that I love talking about, this whole idea that Christianity, Messianic Judaism, they all have this idea of what Mashiach is. That idea is entirely Pharisaic in the first century. The Essenes have a little hint of it because they were influenced by the Pharisees. The Sadducees do not have any idea of Mashiach in that sense. When we see Mashiach used throughout the Tanakh, through the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, Mashiach is used in a bunch of different ways and never in a way of the idea that Christianity has of what Mashiach is. The Pharisees, however, have created this idea of an anointed one who is coming to sort of save the world. And the Christian idea, or I shouldn't say, the New Testament idea of Mashiach and the Christian drawings out from that actually are Pharisaic in origin, which I find really fascinating. Because without the Pharisees and without a Pharisaic understanding, we would have no idea of Mashiach in the sense that we've been able to understand Mashiach from the New Testament. It is completely and entirely Pharisaic. The Sadducees did not have this idea, and a lot of the other Jewish folks did not either. There's a few things that I get into where I get into sort of the genealogy of Matthew. I don't want to get bogged down in that too much, but there are answers to people who will tell you that Yeshua cannot be Mashiach because Yohanika, an online course. So, okay, my wife is saying,
Let's talk about it.
okay, we're trying to do a rabbinic course to answer sort of objections that you may get from people who are telling you that you can't believe in Yeshua. And so we want to be able to sort of help congregations sort of answer some of these questions that come up, because if you do find this about Yechaniah, he is cursed, and it says that the kingdom is taken away in the actual Tanakh, in the prophets, or no, in the writings, not in the prophets. But rabbinically, he's restored to power through repentance, according to the Rambam. So the Rambam actually justifies him. He is also giving here David and Solomon, through which Mashiach needs to come. So he also has that concept as well in his mind, that Mashiach needs to have a lineage that comes from David and Solomon. And so he's proving that here in the book of Matthew, trying to prove his genealogy connected to David and Solomon. He's also understanding it in the sense of it is coming from the tribal lineage comes from the father. And so he's trying to prove that here for Joseph in Matthew chapter 1. He does the same thing in Luke as well. But it's not going through David. It's not going through David and Solomon in Luke, and so Luke is not the thing to start with. The one in Matthew is, because he's holding to that idea of patrilineal tribal heritage. Interestingly enough, Paul, he actually upholds this idea of Jewishness through the mother and tribal lineage through the father, which is again another rabbinic idea. So if you go through the Torah, you'll see it all comes from the father, all comes from the father. If your father is Jewish, your father is Jewish, your father is Jewish, your father is Jewish, then you're Jewish. Rabbinically, it comes from the mother. And Paul actually circumcises Timothy because it is heard that his mother is Jewish, but does not circumcise Titus because he's not Jewish at all. But he's actually saying, well, no, Timothy, you're a Jew, and so therefore I need to get you circumcised. And again, I have read the book of Galatians where he talks very negatively about circumcision. So this idea, not negatively about circumcision, but he just doesn't have this place where Gentiles need to necessarily get circumcised. But he does circumcise Timothy. So we're trying to, you want me to talk about all that? Maybe I'll have you come up and talk about all the courses that we're trying to do. So we're trying to write a book. We're trying to write this commentary on the book of Matthew. We're trying to do a defense course for you. So when an anti-missionary, somebody like Rabbi Tovia Singer or Rabbi Shmuley Boteach or Rabbi Moshe Shulman, although I use some of Rabbi Moshe Shulman's stuff to prove that the New Testament actually has some good things to say. So I appreciate Rabbi Moshe Shulman. Of all my anti-missionary friends, he's probably one of my favorite ones. But those are all being able to have answers for them is one of the things that we're trying to do, right? And so we're trying to give you rabbinic answers that aren't so easy to argue against. So that's one of the projects that we're also working on. So, good. You also have a bit of gematria that comes into play. Aaron told me that you have some people who are very into gematria. Okay, so in this gematria we have in Matthew 1:17. I mean, I can just literally go through the book of Matthew and sort of show out some of these things that are going on. But you have 14, 14, 14. If you actually go back and you try to calculate where it's 14, 14, 14, and it adds up to 42, it doesn't actually. The number of people listed there does not add up to 42, which is a problem. Either Matthew is really bad at math, or he is trying to do something that's related to gematria. So in gematria, the idea of redemption is the three hands of Hashem. Not that Hashem has three hands, but the three hands of redemption. So it's talked about the exodus from Egypt, the upraised hand, the strong hand, and I forget the other hand. I'm trying to remember all three hands, but those three hands are all used in the first redemption. And so Matthew is trying to make a hint that yad, 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 14, 14, 14, which is the gematria for hand is 14. I got ahead of myself. The gematria for hand is 14. And so he's going through and connecting it to the idea of the first redemption through the number 14. 14 also happens to be the gematria of David. So you also have the gematria of David as well. 42 also has a significant thing, gematria as well. There's a lot going into 42, but I won't get too much into detail with that here. I'll just say this: it is associated with the idea of Mashiach ben Yosef in the 42nd day of the counting of the Omer. So there is also that which occurs as well. We see these rabbinic things all through the Gospels. One of the easy ones to sort of point out is in Acts chapter 3. I'll get off of Matthew for a second. But in Acts chapter 3, you have the apostles going up for the time of prayer at the 9th hour. Anybody know what prayer that is? Huh?
3 o'clock?
The 3 o'clock, yeah. The 9th hour, which would be about 3 o'clock or so. It varies in time. It's the Shemona Esrei for Minka. Yep. And so they're going up for Minka prayer, which is entirely Pharisaic. You can search your Torah and you won't be able to find anything that refers to a Minka prayer. But the apostles in the book of Acts were going up and doing it. And so I did Minka prayer shortly before coming here because it needs to be done before sunset. So Minka prayer and the Amidah. And then if you follow the rest of the chapter in the book of Acts, it follows the pattern of the original Amidah prayer. So the Amidah prayer was changed around the time of the destruction of the temple because there were believers who they wanted to sort of flush out a little bit. So they put an extra blessing in there, but the original one follows the book of Acts, and you actually go through all those different kinds of things. While we're dealing with Acts, no, I won't get into that too much. That's really complicated. In Acts chapter 7. Anybody have any questions about what I've said now? I like interaction. I'm always best when I have sort of people asking me questions and sort of trying to figure out, is there anything where you say, hey, maybe he's against the Pharisees here? Or anybody have any questions in that kind of idea? Huh? That I am against the Pharisees? No. People have told me that I can't believe in Yeshua and be in Orthodox Judaism. So, huh?
Why is that?
So I get it from two sides, either from the Christian side or from the Jewish side. So they say that our sages rejected Yeshua, and so therefore you cannot practice Orthodox Judaism and also believe in Yeshua. I guess the same argument is made from the Christians, but in a slightly different way. And the idea is, well, we were given the traditions from the church, and so therefore we should follow the traditions of the church. And I say, Jesus argues with some of the traditions of the church. So in the Jewish aspect of it, there are actually quite a few rabbis that actually speak quite positively about Yeshua. So Rabbi Yaakov Emden is one of the rabbis who actually speaks quite positively about Yeshua. There is Yehuda Chassid, which speaks quite positively about Peter. Peter actually is attributed to having written some of the prayers that we pray in the Siddur. And we also have the Arizal. So the Arizal is Rabbi Isaac. Okay, I'm just going to say the Arizal because I don't want to mess up the name. Isaac Luria Ashkenazi, I think, is his full name. But he was one of the greatest Kabbalists, and he actually goes through in one of his Kabbalistic works, and he says, I have spoken to the spirits of righteous people at their graves, and at the grave of Jesus the Christian, he taught me Torah, and he actually says that it's one of the graves of the righteous. He includes the grave of Jesus the Christian as being one of the graves of the righteous. So the Arizal actually agrees with that. The Ramad is another rabbi. Now, he will say some things that will be a little bit difficult to take, but the Ramad actually says that Yeshua the Christian, was the secret of the Messiah ben Joseph, the Messiah who would die for the sins of the world. So you actually have quite a few very prominent rabbis arguing for the case that actually Yeshua is not as bad as sort of most Orthodox will make him out to be. And so you have some of these rabbis who actually make a good argument. There is also one, a very expensive book that's been translated into English, but a very good one. So Rabbi Eliyahu Zvi Soloveitchik wrote a commentary on the New Testament. So he, what we have left of it is the book of Matthew. We don't have anything else. So the Soloveitchiks are a very big family in Orthodox Judaism. The Soloveitchik family is responsible for modern Orthodox Judaism. Modern Orthodox Judaism, the one that pops into my mind is Ben Shapiro. Do you guys know who Ben Shapiro is? Yeah. Okay. So Ben Shapiro is a very popular modern Orthodox Jew. So the Soloveitchiks are responsible for the modern Orthodox movement. They're also responsible for the Brisker movement. The Brisker movement is bent down, they wear a fedora as well, but they're not Hasidic, and they have a way of learning Torah that incorporates science and other things like that. So the Soloveitchiks were a very big family. They're also a very big family still in Chicago. But Rabbi Eliyahu Zvi Soloveitchik actually wrote a commentary on the book of Matthew, is what we have left. And it's really, really enlightening to see the positive things that he says about Yeshua in that book. Yes?
So are you saying that the three hands of God, Yad Bria, Yad Hadim, Yad Geulah, has something to do with Matthew chapter 1?
Yes. Because he's talking about the idea of redemption. And so the three hands of God that are partaking in redemption from Exodus are partaking in the Exodus from, or the redemption that's happening from Yeshua.
Yeah, because if you do the 14 generation, that doesn't add up. That
Right.
doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And then, but if in a Kabbalic sense, if you have a understanding of, the gematria,
Right.
that fits in pretty equally.
Yeah.
They're Jewish people, so.
Right.
it would be-
So he's using that, and the people who are reading it in the first century are very much aware of that. But it's been lost to most readers of the New Testament who don't know about that gematria.
Yeah, like the 153, you know what I mean?
Right.
When I got into Messianic, they explained to me about 153, which I was totally lost. I was like, what? But
The link is just through the gematria, right?
Through the gematria, yeah.
But that is pretty clear, the 42, 14, 14, 14.
So yeah, so you have the 14, 14, 14, and it's very clear that it's relating back to the three hands of redemption from Exodus. One of the places that really talks about it, one of the rabbinic sources that talks about this three-hand thing that I've used in the video is a rabbinic commentary known as the Petuch Chotam. So that commentary gets into the three hands as well about the redemption from Egypt. And that's sort of where I've seen it, when I've been able to connect it to this idea of this redemption.
you say two kochotim?
Petuch Chotam, so openings of the nose.
Write it down if you want.
I always fail at spelling it.
We'll send it to you later if you want.
Yeah, we're staying with you, so you can, I can look it up and send it to you. But he brings that idea as well. Yeah.
And so that the understanding of that is he's making that direct Ben Yosef, it's Messiah Ben Yosef, because we're talking about those three hands of redemption.
Right,
It's signaling.
a Ben
right out
Yosef.
saying it.
But he's also starting out calling him Mashiach ben David.
Yeah, he's saying it in multiple ways.
Right. Well, he's saying Ben David at the beginning,
Ben David.
and then hinting at Ben Yosef. So when he sits there and he says Yeshua HaMashiach ben David, he's getting into the whole idea of Yeshua HaMashiach ben David, which makes my life really difficult, right? So if I'm trying to defend Yeshua as Mashiach ben David, it's a really difficult task to do, because he's supposed to bring the final kingdom. And like I said, Chabad has an answer for me that I rely upon a lot, right? So there is this idea of Mashiach ben David with the aspect of Mashiach ben Yosef. And so Yeshua, he's going through and he's talking about the kingdom of heaven is at hand, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And then halfway through Matthew, a little more than or a little less than halfway, or a little more, he changes it to the Son of Man must be lifted up, the Son of Man must be lifted up, the Son of Man must be lifted up. So he moves from Mashiach ben David to Mashiach ben Yosef. So it's all based upon whether or not the idea of the generation will accept him or reject him. And so this idea of Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David being one and the same person, while it is a minor opinion, it is found in some sources. Likutei Moharan 16 talks about the idea of Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David being the same person. Rashi in Daniel in chapter 12 talks about the idea of Mashiach being revealed, concealed, which is a euphemism for his death or being taken away, and then revealed again. So Rashi, the greatest commentator on the Torah, or in the Tanakh, himself hints at the idea that Mashiach will be revealed, concealed, and revealed. So it's there in Rashi as well, right? So these, the early believers in Yeshua were holding something that Rashi would be talking about on Daniel 12:12. So this concept, they certainly had a good grasp on. And again, Rashi, nobody argues on Rashi. Nobody argues on Rashi, right? If you can bring a Rashi, I mean, okay, people argue on Rashi. Nobody dismisses Rashi. If Rashi says it, it's going to have significant weight. Let's see. I'm just going to try to get into some of the other things that were going to be talked about. I don't want to get too overly controversial, so I'm trying to keep it not as controversial as I can. You like controversy? Say that.
I do have a question.
Yes.
Now, you're talking about, what's it, I just added that.
Rashi?
Oh, anti-missionary?
Oh, anti-missionary Rabbi Moshe Shulman?
No, the other one.
Shmuley Boteach?
No, the other one.
Tovia Singer.
Yeah, Tobias Singer.
Right.
Now, he kind of threw a little loop when I was listening to him one time.
Okay.
And it was from Matthew 3.
Okay.
And he said that there's no way that Isaiah 7 would ever coincide with it.
Okay. In Matthew 3, with the birth, I guess?
Yeah, the birth, yes.
Okay.
The virgin birth.
Right.
And if you look back and you look in like the Hebrew Bible, it doesn't say a virgin.
Right. Or it doesn't.
No, it doesn't.
Right.
And so it could be just a woman.
Right.
But, and so,
So, so,
almost here a couple times.
so it is, so okay. My friends over in Alternate Media have some great approaches to this. We have a number of ways to deal with, one, the virgin birth, and two, a number of sort of going ideas which are all sort of plausible. So when I talk about the idea of this, and then I talk about the idea of that, and I talk about the idea of this,
It's never one of those three hands.
it could be, yeah, it could be any one of those three or all three of those together. So it does not say virgin, and I've been told reliably from those who know Greek better than I do, that the word used there is sort of generic, and it can also mean young maiden, it can mean virgin, or it can mean one of those things.
Said it the same thing in Isaiah too.
In Isaiah, right, so in Isaiah, Alma means young woman. It does not mean necessarily a virgin. Typically, the age of that young woman, the Alma, yeah? Oh,
I didn't mean to cut you off, I just got my.
oh, okay.
So one of the things issues I have with that, I mean,
Well, hold on, Brian, you have an issue?
no, I know, I'm okay with, Messiah can be Messiah, it doesn't have to be born of the Virgin.
Right.
But when looking at it analytically, it seems when Isaiah is describing the Messiah, the coming Messiah, that when I read those passages in context, it seems like he is giving us ways, if you will, to identify this is what to look for. This is, so to me, describing it as he will be born of a young woman doesn't narrow it down very much. Since we're all pretty much born of young women. So that,
So,
right, I mean, so that's why, and I've heard that it's possible to interpret it, even from the original Hebrew, as virgin. It would not necessarily be so, so I don't know, I'm asking.
so
you
okay.
that.
So if you're an 11 or 12-year-old young lady, typically they're still a virgin, right? So the word used there typically refers to somebody between the ages of 11 and to 12 and a half. So it's a small little gap. One of the things, I think it's the Patuchi Chotam. I want to say it's the Patuchi Chotam. So this other guy, he talks about the birth of Yitzhak. I believe it's Patuchi Chotam. If I'm wrong, forgive me. Now it's on the internet, so if I'm wrong, the internet's forever. I believe it's Patuchi Chotam, but it might be Kedushas Levi. He brings up the idea of the birth of Yitzhak had to be done in purity. And so why did Abraham need to be 99 years old and Sarah needed to be 90 in order to have the birth of Yitzhak? The idea is that, and there's lots of kids here. So I'm going to try to talk, we're talking about virginity. So I'm going to try to talk about it in sort of ways that would be appropriate. So bear with me if I sort of stumble over my words, because I'm trying to be conscious of the children, but also address the topic. The idea of the period of being of nidda blood creates something that is not holy in a woman, and in somebody righteous like Isaac, who's sort of very much portrayed as an image of Mashiach, needs to be born in absolute purity, right? He is, at the Akedah, he, according to some midrashim and some opinions, he actually dies at the Akedah, that he's actually sacrificed. My wife, she finds this opinion of mine crazy, but it is an opinion that's held. Is that he actually dies, and the idea of it is that he had to be born in absolute purity in order to pass on. He's the first sort of Jew that passes on the traditions from the fathers, and so in order to do that, Abraham had to be old, and so that he couldn't his natural sort of inclinations for having children, I'm trying to put it in ways that are kosher for kids to hear, is diminished as he gets older, right? So at 99, it's far less than when you're a teenager, the desire for children. And I'm trying to talk about it in a way that is appropriate. So, and then also, she needs to no longer have menstrual blood. She no longer needs to be having PMS. And so that blood needs to be taken. So now that that's gone, she's no longer contaminated by that. He's no longer contaminated by his youthful desires. And so then he's born in purity. So this idea of being born in purity actually does come from a Jewish source. That being said, is she between the ages of 11 and a half and 12 and a half? Again, this is hard for sort of the modern mind to grasp, but there was several periods in the Jewish history where you would get married at a very young age in order to protect the woman. So the idea of 11 and a half and 12 and a half, there's a whole set of laws that go into marrying at that age and what happens, and Miriam does seem to follow into some of these, right? So 11 and a half to 12 and a half is very specific, but also not a virgin. Now, you can hold to a virgin birth from the rabbis. So in Hagiga, I want to say it's 15. It might be 5, but I want to say 15. There is an idea of a virgin birth in that sense. I need to get into what is a virgin, and I'm trying to figure out how to do it appropriately. So halakhically does not always have to match up with facts. So if the way of a man with a woman is done in a non-traditional way, I'll say, it does not take away her virginity, as long as I'm really struggling because of all the children. If I could be more explicit, it would be a little bit easier. If the parts are intact, she is a virgin, right? So in Hagiga 15a, it's talked about Shmuel, where he was a doctor and he was never a rabbi. And the concern was whether or not he allowed to be would be allowed to be married to a Cohen, because Cohens have to marry virgins. And so Shmuel was able to be in that way with a woman, but not destroy the parts. And so the rabbis say, we're not concerned about this, which means that that woman would potentially be halakhically a virgin and able to marry. The thing that they are concerned about, however, is the bathhouse. So getting pregnant from a bathhouse. I'm trying to remember the Hebrew term. I'm trying to say the Hebrew term correctly because I've always said it wrong. But it's the idea of the child becoming pregnant from a bathhouse. So in Hagiga 15, you'll see this conversation that goes on, and they are concerned about that because they did have a sense that there could be a conception in that way. Okay? So we can either have the intimacy through the way of Shmuel, in which case he is from Joseph and also from Miriam, but she is halakhically a virgin, if not actually a virgin. The other way is the bathhouse, in which case she is actually a virgin, but she goes through the bathhouse. So we say that scientifically that's not possible, but so is a virgin birth, right? So you have the same issue, right? So they can have the bathhouse. The thing is it has to come from Joseph. If it doesn't come from Joseph, then it is not, he is disqualified from being Mashiach, which is a bigger problem. And so Rabbi Tovia Singer, well, he'll say that it just means young woman, it doesn't mean virgin. And he'll say that it's twisting scriptures, and therefore the scriptures are twisted. And that's really his big argument, is that we're changing the definition of scripture, but it occurs several times in the Talmud where they actually change it in order to make a point. So my argument to Rabbi Tovia Singer is that the changing of it is that they're changing it to make a point, as good Talmudists would do. So if you learn it in a Talmudic way, you can change it in order to make a point. They do this for us in Isaiah 9:5 or 9:6. They change the actual structure of the word in order for us not to be able to say that's Mashiach. Targum Yonason, however, takes the word Aviad and changes it to Mashiach, to only Mashiach. So the Aramaic is that it's an everlasting Messiah, right? And so they change the actual statement of the word in order to argue against the idea that it is talking about Mashiach in Isaiah 9:5. It is a Talmudic thing that is done, where you change it in order to make a point. So that's really his argument. That's the argument he's getting at deeper than the idea that it doesn't mean virgin. But the idea that it doesn't mean virgin in the Greek, it can either mean virgin or young maiden. Young maiden would be very important because it's now an allusion back to Sarah and Abraham. And this idea of being outside of the realm of menstrual blood, but from a different perspective.
Would you or any of your colleagues ever want to debate him? Would you ever feel a need, or would you be afraid to debate him?
I wouldn't feel afraid to debate him. My problem is it typically goes around in the same way that Aaron experienced when we were debating Rabbi Gentlecore, is that it oftentimes, in order to defend the opinion, it'll get into circular reasoning.
Well, sure, I understand that. But he accuses Christians of doing that.
Right.
You know, that very same thing. So he would be doing his own deal.
Okay, but how long were we supposed to go for?
He doesn't care. It's open ended.
Okay.
He said he would stay here till tomorrow morning talking, but we might not have anybody left.
Okay.
Do we need to go on to something else?
No, she was saying wrap it up because our kids are falling apart. They've been up since 4 o'clock this morning.
So I said by 8, we'll wrap it up.
So yeah, we got another 40 minutes. So I would not mind debating him. The issue is that it gets into a lot of circular reasoning, and he also, when he presents his arguments, he's presenting his arguments typically to a group that doesn't know rabbinic thinking, and he's typically arguing against Christians who don't know Hebrew as well. And so when he's making his points, he's not going to bring out all the other places. Like, he's not going to undercut his argument, right? So he's not going to allow for the argument of, it says here and here, this and this is possible. And so he's going to just dig into his heels and say, no, this is the only way that Judaism understands it, because he's not playing for me. He's going to be playing it for the Christians. So I would have no problem debating him. The issue is, one, will he want to do that with the amount of rabbinic knowledge that I've sort of already put out there that I know, because I'm going to be able to bring receipts for these things.
That's what I'd like to see him come up against,
Right,
you know, because he's always hitting guys that really don't know.
right,
And some of them have held their own with it.
right,
When you get right down to it.
right,
He probably won the debate, but yet they didn't do too bad.
right. Yeah.
And so, you know, but I see, and I see some chinks in his armor, that really bother me. And why do people try to make it mean what they want it to mean?
Right.
I mean,
So it's defensive. I mean, I've had the same thing also with Christians as well.
yes, right.
Like, you'll get into and you'll say, well, it means this. And, well, no, it doesn't. Like, one of the ones that we get, the Christians and other Messianists tend to get bogged down to is the kiss the son one, Nikashovar. And Rabbi Tovia Singer, I've seen him literally take that and tear it apart, because Nikashovar is always translated in our Psalms as kiss the son. Yalkut Me'am Loez says it means kiss the wheat, because bar in Aramaic is son. Bar in Aramaic is son. The same is also wheat. It's wheat in Hebrew. So it means kiss the wheat. And the idea that it has a messianic connotation is found in Yalkut Me'am Loez, but it doesn't mean kiss the son. But oftentimes I'll see Christians debate him and double down on the idea of it means kiss the son. Obviously, it's messianic. It means kiss the son. And he'll sit there and he'll go, with the smug smile that he always does, no, it means kiss the wheat, and you don't know what you're talking about. It's not messianic. It's just talking about kissing the wheat. I'll bring out Yokoti Me'am Loez, which says it means kiss the wheat, but that was a euphemism for a messianic kissing the wheat as of the king. Right? So you do have these ideas, but he doesn't want to bring them out. Right? So, you had a question?
Yes, I've got one question about the word virgin.
Okay.
Is there another word that they could have used that specifically meant virgin?
Yes, basula. Basula or batula. If you're Sephardic, batula. If you're Ashkenaz,
Saying in
basula.
the Greek, you said there's one in the Greek that,
Parenthios.
and that can mean either man.
Yes. Based upon people who know Greek better than I do. So I don't know Greek very well. I know Hebrew a lot better.
I understand, but in the Greek, so that's what I guess what I was asking.
Yeah.
But in the Hebrew, I understand there was another word.
Yes. So
In Isaiah, right?
in Isaiah is Alma, which means young woman, typically between a certain specific age.
Right.
It's a lot more specific than I thought.
Right.
Yeah.
But they take this scripture in Isaiah, all right?
Right.
And then they use it in the New Testament.
Right.
And to me, it's kind of different. You know?
Between the two words.
Yeah, well, like I had one guy arguing with me, and I was just asking questions.
Mm-hmm.
But he said, well, you know, there where he says, behold, something big happened there. All right, but we're not talking about that right there. We're talking about in Isaiah
Right.
7.
Right.
And and you can't take what's being argued and prove it by necessarily.
Right.
There has to be something else to prove if you're really gonna win the argument.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you know, it just seemed like, and I knew I was just gonna go round and round in circles, and I wasn't trying to prove it.
Right.
I'm just trying to get to the truth of it,
Right.
because they're using that
Right.
in the New Testament.
Right.
They're saying, this is that.
And it's all over the place.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at it, Acts chapter 7. A lot of that stuff is not what you would find in the scriptures. You have a lot of places where you have quotes being made about Tanakh that are different than what's actually in the Tanakh, right? And so I was watching my mother. My mother, she's Jewish, but she doesn't really get into like a whole bunch of this stuff. And I said, Acts chapter 7 doesn't match up with what you have in Genesis 49. And my mom was going, then what do I do? I was like, it's rabbinic, it's okay. This is what we do, right? Like, if you go through and you go through the Targums, things are always translated to something slightly different. The amount of places where they put Mashiach in, it would make us blush, as Rivka's old rabbi would say. They put Mashiach all over the place where it doesn't say Mashiach. So you're able, in a Targum, in a translation, you're able to change some of the actual wording. And it happens often. Anybody who's learned anything about what's called the Targums in Judaism would understand that that is just simply proof, it's actually proof that they're using Pharisaic interpretational methods. The fact that they are slightly changing the word. That they're going based upon not the actual verse in Isaiah, but a Targum. Now, the argument that people will say to me is, well, we don't have that Targum. And I'll say, well, we don't have a lot of Targums. So, move topics. Okay. So you have a bunch of places where these arguments are used. In Matthew chapter 5, did I get into Matthew chapter 5? The Kal V'chomer? I got into that, right? You also have the idea of Son of God. This is another big one that we can get into. It's a little bit controversial. But a Son of God actually means something in rabbinic literature as well. There's this idea of being a Son of God, which means that you are fully committed and submitted to the will of Hashem. So that is also rabbinic as well. One of the ones that I really like a lot, it makes me really happy. Oh, you had a question?
I was saying bye.
Oh, okay. Where's the temptation when he's led out to the temptation in John? I think it's in John 3, right? No, it's in Matthew. It's in Matthew. In Matthew 3, because we talked about it in our video. I don't know if you guys have been able to see that video. Huh? Okay. So there is a tradition that the Messiah will be born on Tish B'Av. So Tish B'Av occurs in the summer. When was Yeshua born? We're going to get into that another time. Supposed to be born on Tish B'Av. So we have in Matthew, it says, and a voice from the heaven said, "This is my son whom I love, with whom I am well pleased." So, right, he's being called son in a little way here. And then it goes into Matthew chapter 4. Yeshua was led by the Ruach into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And he had fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, and he was hungry. It's really interesting. There is a tradition in Judaism where you fast for 40 days and 40 nights after Tish B'Av until Rosh Hashanah. So you fast for 40 days. Some is after So some start right after Tish B'Av, some wait till the 17th Tammuz, some wait a little bit farther. But it seems to be indicating here that Yeshua, in fact, was fasting these 40 days. Because in the book of Luke, we have him get up and he reads from the Haftarah portion of Isaiah chapter 61. Isaiah chapter 61 just so happens to be the reading for the Shabbat before Rosh Hashanah, which would be exactly 40 days after Tish B'Av. And so Matthew seems to be getting into this idea of he is actually fasting the 40 days, as was common at that time, in between Tish B'Av and Rosh Hashanah. And I just find that as an amazing little tidbit, because it puts him into a calendar, it puts him into a way of understanding things. And if you combine it with what we find in Luke, he's reading Isaiah 61, which is the parsha he would be reading 40 days after Tish B'Av when he's called my son. So one of the other things that I really want to impress upon you, since Rivka's saying my time is running out, is not only the idea of what rabbinics are being used in the actual text, but also the idea that Matthew is writing outside of that, and he's also incorporating these rabbinic ideas into the text after the fact, right, to make his point, right? So he's stating certain things in certain ways in order to make it clear that he's coming from a Pharisaic perspective. There was no need to put in, he fasted 40 days and 40 nights and he was hungry, right? Like, what does that have? Why is that in there? And this is what Judaism will do. I'm trying to think of the other ones that I typically bring up. There's also the one in Matthew 23, where he's actually giving, he's actually telling us to keep 23, I think it's 35, where he says you should have tithe mint, dill, and cumin, while not neglecting the weightier matters of the law. And so tithing mint, dill, and cumin is a stringency found specifically in Niddah 49 to 50. So it was an idea that was talked about in the Talmud, about whether or not you, Yaakov did something to my phone, about whether or not you tithe mint, dill, and cumin. And so it's a debate even to this day as to whether or not you tithe from mint, dill, and cumin. He also talks about washing the inside of the cup and the outside of the cup. So there was one set of Pharisees that would wash the outside of that would wash the outside of the cup but not the inside of the cup. There's a second group of Pharisees. This time he's taking the opinion of Beis Shammai that would say to wash the inside and the outside of the cup. So he's actually taking it on a higher level in a stringency that's not found even in today's Judaism, right? He's taking a stringency beyond that. Another thing I can get into that's maybe a little outside of just the New Testament, what's going on in the New Testament. Because there's so much. One of the things, finish off with the New Testament in this, and then I'll bring out this idea of believers in Jesus and the Talmud, right? Because this is another thing that the anti-missionaries will bring up often. Though I actually think Bateach or Singer actually argues, I think, pretty well that Jesus is not mentioned in the Talmud, generally speaking. I'll do another one because I just saw it pop up here, and I was asked this recently. It says, why do all the gospel writers put in Father, your Father in heaven? Why do they never use the name? And so it's a Pharisaic idea and a rabbinic idea to use a circumlocution, right? So I will never say the name Adoshem. I'll say Hashem. I will never say the name Elohim. Replace the K with a Hey for that name. I will never say the name Kale. Take off the K. And so the followers of Yeshua, or the writers who wrote Yeshua, always refer to God in heaven as the Father, or by some other sort of circumlocution, which is a Pharisaic thing in which you do. So he would never use the actual name, indicating a Pharisaic basis for it. I mean, it's all over the place. So outside of that, we do have a couple indications of followers of Yeshua actually being involved. And right now, Aaron and I on TikTok are getting into it with this rabbi about this topic specifically. But there are followers of Yeshua who are mentioned in Talmud who actually do match up with the timeline. And they're sometimes not talked about in a negative way. So in Chulin 84a, it says Yaakov Hamin, Yaakov Hamina, which means Yaakov the heretic. Mina typically indicates a follower of Yeshua, or a min typically means a follower of Yeshua. You typically can read that in. It doesn't only mean a follower of Yeshua, so there is a slight possibility it could be a not, but I think the Tosafot supports my view. That Yaakov Amina comes in and he talks about the slaughter of deer and cows. And so halakhically, the halakha nowadays is that if you slaughter a cow, you don't cover its blood. But if you were to slaughter a deer or a bison, you do cover its blood. And Yaakov Amina comes in and says, actually, you cover for both. He shows up in another place. He shows up in Megillah. So the rabbis argue against him and say he's wrong. But he also shows up in Megillah as well, where he actually says that you have 6 people come up for Yom Kippur. And in fact, we do have 6 people come up for Yom Kippur to read from the Torah. And he's not argued against, which means that his opinion is being taken as a legitimate opinion. Which I think is really, really important for us to take a look at, because he's now being validated by the Talmud itself. The other one is in Sefer Hasidim. So in Sefer Hasidim 191, again, a very, very expensive book. Rivka calls it the golden book because it's $250. We found it for $250 on sale. It's out of print. But the Sefer Hasidim in English in 191 actually says that Shimon Kefa is a Tzaddik, which means he is a righteous one, even after he converted out to Christianity. And we call him by a derogatory name because he converted to Christianity, but he is still righteous. And so we call him by that name. And so that's really arguments coming from outside that the actual followers of Yeshua are important. Anybody have any questions? Because we have about 20 minutes. I'd love to answer any questions because I really like your question, David.
I'm afraid to answer it.
Huh?
I'm afraid to ask anymore.
Why?
Because it went off and on. We're trying to come to an end there.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's all right. No, it was good. It was all good.
Okay.
I thought people were getting tired of it.
Anybody have any other questions? Or, I mean, you have Hanukkah in John 10:30, right? Which is Pharisaic. Just a bunch of that different stuff.
You're saying that Kepha converted to Christianity, but wouldn't the disciples have been doing the same thing basically that you guys are doing?
Yeah.
They were keeping, yeah.
They didn't
I
convert
mean,
to anything.
yeah,
Right.
still going to synagogue and doing the same thing they always did. They
Right.
just believed.
They just stayed Orthodox Jews.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we have a God of the Shimon Kefa, which argues essentially that. So there's a rabbinic source that talks about a debate between Paul and Peter, and that they pretty much stayed Orthodox Jews to their death. There's some things we'll argue and disagree with in that work, but it is there.
Well, the use of the term when you said Yeshua the Christian.
Right.
Since when was Yeshua ever a Christian?
Well, that's how it's referred to in rabbinic text.
I get why they would say that, but
Yeah.
that's,
That's what I was gonna say, too. There's really no conversion into Christianity.
Right.
Christianity was, that was a derogatory
Right.
didn't come around the way after. They were Jews
Mhm.
or non-Jews who wanted to follow those Jews.
Right.
Well, they believed in Yeshua and wholeheartedly that they'd give their life.
Israelites is what I should say. Israel.
Right. Yeah. So I'm using Jesus a Christian to indicate that when I say Jesus a Christian, it's obviously arguing that it's probably pretty clearly for our Yeshua. So his name was probably actually Yesu, because it was translated into Greek as Jesus, which then became Jesus. But his name was actually probably Yesu because the Galileans couldn't pronounce the shin and they couldn't pronounce the of the ayin at the end. So his name was probably not actually Yeshua. It was probably actually Yesu. Yeah. Because the Galileans had a difficulty in pronouncing the shin and the ayin. I mean, it comes up comically in the Talmud.
And they won the war, didn't they, when they're trying to come in as spies?
Yeah.
They had to say a certain word,
Yeah.
and they couldn't say it.
Right. So you have that there as well. But they stayed all within the way. And one of the things that we're really trying to do, so we're looking to move out here and sort of restart that. One of the things that we get, I'll give my sort of closing arguments and reasons why our ministry and what we're doing is important to support. One of the reasons is because we are always told, you make a good argument for Yeshua, but it's only you by yourself. You don't have a community. So one of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to make a community. In order to do that, we have to get our ideas into print. So one of the members of the board of our ministry goes, David, you need to write. 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 And I go, I need to write, but I'm also, like Aaron, working 2 jobs and trying to do this ministry, right? And so I come home and I also have, a bunch of little kids running around. So I come home and I'm just very exhausted. So for me to write something, it just takes a lot. One of the things that I want to, yeah. To write everything down for me, right? Yeah. So one of the things that we're sort of gunning for is to give me a month of writing. So if I were to have a month of writing, I could make the argument and put the argument into a book. So there have been 2 books that I've been trying to write for the last 10 years. 3 books that I've been trying to write for the last 10 years, and I've never been able to get around to it because conversations with people are much more important to me than writing a book. But my people say in order for me to get the idea out there is for me to write a book. So the 3 books that I'm trying to write, one of them is Melech Mamet Umachaya Uzamach Yeshua, which is a prayer that we say 3 times a day. And it means the king who dies and is brought back to life and who spreads out salvation. And so I was going to use that prayer as a basis for coming up for a defense of Yeshua from rabbinics that you could open up a good conversation with or debate Tovia Singer if you get the chance. Using rabbinics to argue that Yeshua is King Messiah, but he also the idea of a Messiah who dies and resurrects, and then a Messiah who spreads through the world, right? So that's one of the books that I wanted to write, is a 4-part book discussing those parts of how Yeshua meets those qualifications from a rabbinic stance. The other book that I've been trying to write is a commentary on the New Testament, and Aaron actually participates with Alternate Media, which is another group that we're partnering with to write a commentary on the New Testament and go through Matthew. And we're also doing videos on that as well, sort of similar to what I did here, but more in depth. And I wanted to write the commentary on that as well. The other thing that I've wanted to write is a defense for a rabbinic messianic movement, so for more people to sort of become like us. And so those are the 3 writing things that I'm really trying to get written. I do believe that if I were to write for 8 hours a day, 8 to 10 hours a day, as my full-time job, I would be able to get out at least 1 or 2 of those books in a month. And so we right now are running at about $2,100 that we're bringing in every month for support. I'm asking for one-time donations to get me to full support, which means that I can stop working at Amazon and stop working at Viho in order to write this book. I'm not saying to keep me at support all the time, but give me 1 month to be able to put into writing for 10 hours. So that's really a financial push that we're trying to make. And so we're about $3,000 short of that goal to pay for all our bills. And that is something that we're trying to do, something that my board member said to come out and try to do. So if you know anybody who has $3,000 sitting around, let me know. I need to go ask them for that. But any little support helps, and it's one-time donations to the book campaign.
I'm just seeing because I have a special project.
And if you're interested in supporting that, Rivka has a special link for the project to be able to get us to me being able to take off a month for work to write those things, and so that instead of me just coming around and sort of talking for, I don't know how long have I been talking, an hour, 2, something along those lines. Have it in a book that you all could read, and then if you meet somebody who's Orthodox in Denver, because there's 90,000 Orthodox Jews in Denver, you can have a better conversation, right? You're going to get the Tovia Singer debates, and you can say, my friend David Costello points out all these rabbinic sources. Is this true? And here's the book, and here's a book. Read it and tell me what you think of it. I'm not saying that we need to actively talk about it, but as people come in contact, it might be a good way to defend Yeshua being the Messiah, and also defend our way of life as Messianics.
So what do you plan on doing? Are you planning on going up to the hills or somewhere away from everything?
Yeah, so I'm gonna lock myself in my room. Yeah,
You can write a book?
I would love to go up to the hills and write, but I first need to have my bills paid. But yeah, if I can find a place that's quiet, my current idea is to lock myself in my room for 8 to 10 hours a day, and then be with the kids, after I'm done writing for my full 8 to 10 hours a day. Taking all my sources. One of the things that's very difficult for me is I have a picture of about 60 sources just on Matthew chapter 5. Where Matthew chapter 5 has about 60 rabbinic sources that I can link to be able to put it in there. But collecting all those sources and listening to all those sources and then getting all those sources into a coherent way of thinking takes time. One of the reasons that the videos haven't been made is because,
It's an undertaking.
yeah, it's an undertaking.
Your wife had a link, or you just go on one of these?
Yeah, Rivka, she has a link or something specifically for that book project.
So we know when we reach our goal.
So we know when we reach that goal, and then I can take a month off. So,
I can text people or email them or
yeah, Rivka has a whole, she's that side of it.
admin.
She's the admin. She handles sort of like making the projects work.
It's, we have a, and Amanda can just send it out to everybody. Amanda, we have everybody on the.
Well, I can get it to you, Amanda. I can get it.
She's got change.
If I didn't ask Aaron about raising support before having this conversation, but I hope he's okay with it. Okay. But that's sort of a project that's just giving me a month to see if I can get it into a book so that it can be something that you can have handy and that you can go, no, my faith really is Jewish, even if you don't run into an Orthodox person in Denver. But as they come into your life, or just being able to defend the attacks from Tovia Singer, I'm sure that if I were to ask around, there would be more than a couple hands of people who used to be Messianic or used to be in this group, but now have left and completely become just straight Orthodox. And so our concern is also that, is going, hey, the rabbis aren't showing you all the stuff. There's other ways that you can think about this and still be rabbinic and the way of your life.
So your heart is for both sides of this, like, I mean, you wanna reach rabbinic Jewish people who are
Right.
not believing Yeshua is Messiah.
Right.
You wanna bring people like us with really, some of us have been Messianic for a while, come out of a Christian background, so that we'll be better equipped just to present those apologetics should we come into that situation.
Yeah. And to defend yourself against leaving Yeshua completely, because that's a really sad thing, right? But also talking, I mean, there's a bunch of people that I've met in my life that go, hey, you've presented this a way I've never heard before. Thank you. Most of them just try to tell me that I'm arguing a Christian point and I'm not, and then it gets into the circle. But I've had somebody shake the finger at me going, when I was talking about the virgin birth, because I give a bunch of arguments that it is possible for a virgin birth, and he goes, I need to write you off because otherwise then I'd have to take it seriously. But also for the people who are leaving Yeshua because they don't know any better from Tovia Singer or whatever else it may be. But also, my vision for Messianic Judaism is, it's going to sound silly, but what would Jesus do, right? So what would Yeshua do? Going back to that old 90s thing with the bracelets. And if Yeshua would live a Pharisaic life, if it was good enough for him, it should be good enough for me. So that's where I'm at, and I guess if you have any other questions, I can take them. And if not, let me know. Yeah.
Why would someone leave Yeshua, go Judaism?
Yeah. You want to answer that?
Because I've dealt with this, I mean, we've both dealt with it a lot, but because when people start asking questions, whether they're in a church or whatever context they're in, when the questions aren't answered, that's when they start seeking other places. And then when they find a place like Orthodox Judaism that answers those questions, they'll accept the answers they get.
Or even allows a question to be asked.
Or like just allowing, so a lot of times it's just simply because questions were asked and they were rebuffed. Or like I just listened to a podcast this last week about a girl who was raised in Texas, like evangelical, fundamental, like
Torah, yeah.
uber, like she went to college to be a missionary, and her biggest thing was when she was growing up, she wasn't allowed to ask questions. So about anything regarding her faith. It's just like, why do we do this or why do we do that, or like something doesn't match up in the Gospels or whatever, or doubts that she had just in faith in general. And then when she found Orthodox Judaism and the typical anti-missionary arguments, her faith completely fell apart within literally days, she said, because they were answering the questions that she had, now not in a way that we would want them to be answered, but like just the fact they were allowed to be asked.
I
She was
also,
allowed to ask.
Churches are that way.
yeah.
Most churches don't want to.
Ask questions.
Right.
That's what's
Right.
nice about like what we have here. We do mid-rock.
Yeah.
We ask questions. Like,
One of the things too that I think why people would leave, I want to add this to it, because I felt this pressure from my own side, from my Are we still on the video? Still live streaming? Folks that I know, who are well-meaning Christians, but because we become so observant in our life, they are pushing for us to come back to Christianity so hard and so ruthlessly. One of the things that is in my life is I always go, I will never be one of those guys that say I will never leave Yeshua. The reason for that being is because I do that, then I put myself into a false mindset of, I'm okay, I'm good. I don't have to worry about protecting about leaving Yeshua. I have felt the pressure from some of my Christian friends and folks that I know who, when the Christians come and go, you got to be Christian, you got to be Christian or Jewish, you got to be Christian or Jewish, you got to be Christian or Jewish. There's been temptations in my mind that go, fine, I can't be Christian, I'm going to be Jewish. And I understand where that feeling comes in, because if somebody doesn't have the strength to say no, or somebody thinks, I'll never leave Jesus, I'll never leave Yeshua, they can often fall into that trap of overconfidence to where they don't recognize that thought that happens in their head when their Christians go, you're too Jewish, you're too observant, you're keeping kosher, you gotta choose one, you gotta choose one. And the thought has occurred in my head, but I've also been able to fight it, I think because I never say I'll never leave Yeshua, because if to do so puts me into that place of, nobody can get me. And then what does God do? He's going to try to humble me by giving me that point where I turn, right? Because I felt that thought in my head going, I'll just leave, fine. I'm being open and honest with you guys more than I usually am, right? Because that thought does occur in your head. And if you're doing it just for the wrong reasons, or if you're doing it just because for whatever you're going to do to be observant, that thought will click in your head. And I think a lot of Christians get pushed when they start going into the Messianic world, or they start going in, you guys have probably all felt it too. You probably get it felt from family where, be Christian, be Christian, be Christian. You're doing that Jewish stuff. You're doing that Jewish stuff. You're doing that Jewish stuff. And that brain switches and goes, I'll just go all the way then. Like, why am I putting up with this? And I think you gotta be really honest with yourself and going, I'm not beyond going that route. And so when it thought occurs in your head, you're looking for it. But I think more Christians leave Yeshua because of Christians than anti-missionaries. Because that pressure.
Right now,
Right.
and you know the family's pulling. Come on.
Christmas.
And that temptation really is the beginning of pride in my heart.
Yeah.
You know? So, when I think that I can't fall, that's when I'm gonna fall.
Right. Yep.
I don't like getting to those positions. I've been there.
But really rooting it in, no, this is what Yeshua would do. And knowing that, okay,
Yeah.
this is what he would do. I'm not doing anything different than what he would do.
Yeah, you have to come back to that, don't you? It seems like this
Yeah.
is exactly what Yeshua would do.
And it holds you into Yeshua, and it holds you into observance. Anyway.
We say we want to be more like Jesus,
Right.
more like Yeshua.
Right. So you get to that 90s thing. What would Jesus do? In some aspect, I took that path literally. So what would he do? Well, he'd be an Orthodox Jew. So here I am.
What you wouldn't do, we celebrate Christmas.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think we're wrapping up too. 'Cause our kids are getting tired. They've been up for a while. But I really had a lot of fun tonight, so thank you guys.
Good seeing you all, and nice meeting you, David. And